Gasoline by Audio Slave. People still love to burn that gasoline, despite rising gas prices, despite mind-numbing traffic and the big enviro push for public transport in big Canadian cities. Cars are still king of the road. Now, our next guest says the future of the car is still bright. Joining us now is Steve Lafleur from the Frontier Centre for Public Policy. Steve, you wrote a magnificent piece on this, but tell me what the premise is. Why was it necessary for you to stand up for the king?
Well, I think it's interesting right now because there's this default assumption that the car is kind of becoming a relic and that we don't really need it. We can move towards public transit to a much greater extent. But the reality is that it's not really all that easy to just do away with the car. There are a lot of things that it can do that you can't really do with public transportation. It's more flexible for a lot of people. It allows for people to access cheaper housing in the suburbs and so forth. So it really does have a place that we can't quite get rid of it just yet.
Now, are you fighting some facts here? Facts having to do with young people not being as enthused about cars as they once were. Menzoides always give me a hard case out. Chuck, there's something wrong with this generation, especially the guys. They care more about smartphones than they do about smart-looking cars.
Well, I mean, I'm guilty of being one of those people. I live in Osborne Village. I don't drive. That's not really my thing. I grew up in the suburbs. I understand the appeal of it. But it's really a preference thing. And as much as I like to think, well, wouldn't it be great if every part of town looked like Osborne Village, or, you know, for people in Toronto, maybe the Annex or something like that. The reality is that it doesn't, and it's because people's preferences are driving them out to lower cost housing in the suburbs.
But see, you're now telling us that to you the car is just utility. It's just functional. It's no different than a toaster. If you stop eating toast, you don't need a toaster. If you live in a place like Osborne Village, Yorkville, the Annex, whatever, you don't need a car. I understand that. But what Menzoid and the other Menzoidians are saying that the car is a love object. It's irrational. You know, people are supposed to have this love affair with the car. Car is not a toaster.
Well, it does still have a bit of a romantic appeal, and it really depends on where you live, your cultural background. I always find it interesting when I speak to people who I know who live in, say, Mississauga, and you know, we talk about meeting in Toronto. And there's always this kind of back and forth. I don't want to drive into the city. There's no parking there. And I'll think, well, I don't want to go to Mississauga because there's nothing there. But that's just, you know, different cultural perspectives.
One of the problems that we have with the conversation, you know, talk about cultural perspectives. There is this perspective among many of us who grew up in the burbs, watching TV. When we watch the city is dangerous. And there's something in that terrific column that you wrote about the TV show Murder, She Wrote, and Honduras and violence. I want you to take us there.
Yeah, so basically there was this column in one of the UK papers, I can't recall off the top of my head, and it looked at the little town in Murder, She Wrote and what the murder rate would be if it was a real place. And it turns out that it would be greater than in Honduras, where they have the highest murder rate in the world. So there's really this perspective that a lot of us have gotten from watching television, that the world is this really dangerous place. And especially when you look at cities, you look at, say, Taxi Driver or all these movies from the 80s that were really violent in New York. A lot of people still kind of have that culturally ingrained in their mind. So I think that a lot of people kind of do see the city that way. And I think it does scare some people off, but that's starting to fade away. So more and more people are finding the city attractive, but it's still a minority. 94% of people in Canada still settle in the suburbs.
But, yeah, the perception of the city as being dangerous continues. You know, it's July 4th, so we'll use an American example. Chicago is considered a murder capital. You hear about these weekends in Chicago where 20, 25 people are blown away. That's horrible, obviously. Most of them are in a certain part of Chicago, a certain part of the South Side. So the average Chicagoan that you talk to feels that he or she, they're living in a very safe city. But people who just have a helicopter view think Chicago is very dangerous. Same thing with Winnipeg. It's often called the murder capital, but of course, just like Chicago, most of the murders take place in a certain part of town that most people who are watching television in Winnipeg aren't hanging out in. They're just kind of watching it. And once again, it's a terrible thing, but the people in Winnipeg, most of them don't feel like they're living in the murder capital. So this urban-suburban split goes on, I think, everywhere. But to get back to the car thing, are you telling me that the future of the car depends on the growth of the suburbs?
Well, I think that the suburbs are going to continue to grow. There are all kinds of things we've done to try to stop it. The reality is what it tends to do is, well, for instance, we try to put barriers around Toronto to stop growth. What it's doing is it's driving up housing costs in the city. So it's actually driving a lot of people even further out, which is making us even more dependent on cars in some ways. So ironically, as much as a lot of people think, well, alternatives to driving really require a lot of government intervention, what's happening is, in fact, that the government intervention we're getting is causing people to drive even more than they would otherwise.
Do we have a lack of rapid transit? I mean, we've got a rapid transit issue that's huge in Toronto. We've got a rapid transit issue that's large, getting larger here in Winnipeg. Is it just government? I mean, you're a critic of government, but a very rational critic. You're not just throwing rocks. You do studies. You're a think tanker. Okay. Do we just have a lot of dumb government? And the reason I ask is because you go to other parts of the world, and the parts of the world that are not as developed as us, don't have the tax base we have, seem to do much better on rapid transit.
Well, what's happening, and to a large extent, is we've got the situation where we've got a tax system that's very top-heavy. So the federal government collects way more than it requires. In fact, you could easily pare it down by a third if you get it out of the things that it's not supposed to be spending on, like public transit. So you've got all these politicized decision-making situations. So in Toronto, for instance, they're building a subway out to Vaughan. And if you know Toronto geography, that doesn't make a lot of sense compared to, say, improving transit downtown, where people use it. But it's all subjected to political forces. So really, the biggest problem in this country, as far as I'm concerned with cities, is we're just not giving cities enough control over their own affairs.
All right, so you're saying government shouldn't be in the business of public transit. But isn't government all over public transit in those other countries that have it?
Well, I think the municipal government should be all over public transit. I just don't think the federal government should be. And one of the things about a lot of these developed countries, or developing countries as well, though, is simply that they haven't got the same regulatory structures we have. It's much easier to build stuff there, whereas here, anytime you want to build anything, it is quite difficult and expensive. Now, part of that is just necessary, health and safety and so forth, and we've got higher labor costs. But a lot of it really is just this political gridlock we've built in.
In 20 seconds or less, what's it going to take for me to get Steve Lafleur into a car?
Well, I often joke that I'd rather live in urban North Dakota than suburban Toronto, so it would be pretty difficult to do so.
Right. Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I know you've spent a lot of time in the States, so I wish you a happy 4th.
Well, thank you. Happy 4th to yourself.